Now that we introduced the topic of hypothesis testing, we're interested in knowing what is a type 1 error and type 2 error. A type 1 error happens if the null hypothesis is rejected when it is true, and type 2 hypothesis happens if the null hypothesis is not rejected when it is actually false. We're going to list these in a nice table. The decision on the left-hand side and the truth of null hypothesis on the right-hand side. We have two options for the null hypothesis. It's either true or it is false based off of the information that we have. If you don't reject the null hypothesis and then the null hypothesis is true, it means that you had a correct decision. But if the null hypothesis is false and you don't reject the null hypothesis, it means that you have type 2 error. If the null hypothesis is true and you reject the null hypothesis, it means that you have type 1 error. If the null hypothesis is false and you reject the null hypothesis, it means that you have a correct decision. So this nice table summarizes different types of error and if you have a correct decision about your scenario or situation that you have. For example, consider the following important case. The USDA limit for Salmonella contamination for chicken is 20%. A meat inspector reports that the chicken produced by a company exceeds, keyword here everybody, that USDA limit. You perform a hypothesis test to determine if the meat inspector's claim is true or not. Identify type 1 and type 2 error here. Let us begin. Remember that since you have percent, it means that you're dealing with the proportion, everybody. That's why you see P as the proportion of population. Let P represents the proportion of the chicken that is contaminated. The meat inspector claim says, hey, it is more than 20%. Okay, it's more than 20%, everybody. What's the meaning of that? It means that your claim is your alternative hypothesis. When it says more than, greater than, it means that you're dealing with the alternative hypothesis. I'm using the same color that I used in introducing the alternative hypothesis, which is green. So it says the proportion of contaminated chicken is more than 20%. So P is more than 20%. Its alternative is more than. So the null is going to be less than or equals to. So let us analyze our error, type 1 error and type 2 error. A type 1 error happens when the actual proportion of contaminated chicken is less than or equal to 20%. So the null is true, but you reject the null hypothesis. So the chicken is not contaminated, but you say that, hey, that chicken is contaminated. A type 2 error happens if the proportion of contaminated chicken is more than 20%, but you fail to reject the null hypothesis. So with a type 1 error, you might create a health scares and hurt the sales of chicken because that chicken is healthy and you say that no, it is contaminated. But for the type 2 error, this is more dangerous. Why is that? Because the chicken is contaminated and then you say that no, that chicken is fine. So we should be very careful about type 1 and type 2 error, specifically when we are making decisions in different scenarios and projects. So here's a summary for you: the truthness of null hypothesis and the decision that you're making. If the null hypothesis is true, and then you don't reject it, it is a correct decision. But if the null hypothesis is true and you reject it, you have a type 1 error. If the null hypothesis is false, and then you don't reject the null hypothesis, you have type 2 error. And if the null hypothesis is false and you reject the null hypothesis, then you have a correct decision.